This is episode 334 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special insider extras when you join us at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. Join today and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Sam Jeremy, PhD candidate at the University of Leeds. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
And this is where somebody would rub their teeth with an abrasive material to remove any sort of build-up of dirt on their teeth. And there was definitely a market for this around Shakespeare's time.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The clown in All's Well That Ends Well talks about picking his teeth. And Coriolanus gives an admonishment about hygiene when he says, bid them wash their faces and keep their teeth clean. John Holland in Henry VI Part 2 talks about having teeth pulled. And in The Winter's Tale, the clown talks about being able to identify a nobleman by how he picks his teeth. Of the more than 50 references to teeth in Shakespeare's plays, most of them are using idiomatic expressions for strength and determination, like to set your teeth against a problem, for example. But a few of the toothy references we can find from the bard demonstrate that when it comes to oral hygiene, Renaissance society had established methods for cleaning your teeth and even for prescribing oral surgery. Here today to talk to us about 16th century toothbrushes, mouthwash, oral surgery, and exactly why it was considered noble to pick food out of your teeth is our guest and author of Carry Not a Picke-Tooth In Your Mouth, an exploration of oral health in early modern writings, Dr. Laura Kennedy. Laura Kennedy completed her PhD in 2013 at Loughborough University and was primarily interested in the relationship between how people understood the way the body worked at the time and how this played out in literature. She set out to research the birth condition, cleft lip and palate, and to find out more about the cultural history of the condition she was born with. But this soon broadened out to become a wider interest in oral health, preventative measures, and how problems were treated in the 17th century. Laura wasn't just interested in the understanding and treatment of such conditions, but also the broader social significance of being a person with facial difference and or oral health issues during the early modern period. Since 2013, Laura's career has moved away from the history of the body to teaching in schools and universities, but she's still very much interested in talking about the history of the cleft lip and palate, which is why she joins us today to talk about oral hygiene from Shakespeare's lifetime. You can find out more about Laura in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Laura. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm excited.
Would someone like Shakespeare have had a toothbrush?
Well, as is so often the case when it comes to answering questions about Shakespeare, we can't know for certain whether he had a toothbrush of some sort in his possession at some point in his lifetime. However, my best guess would be no for a few reasons. So there's been toothbrushes of some form. The initial early toothbrushes were made of twigs that had been flayed at the ends, which people would chew on to try and get their teeth clean. And that dates back to ancient Egypt. So we're talking over 5,000 years ago. And the first bristle brush that we see is in 15th century China, would you believe it? So around 500 years ago. And these were made, they would take bristles from a pig and attach them to bone or bamboo to create a brush. So you can imagine that would be pretty rough on the old gums and on your teeth. So we've had toothbrushes of some form for quite a long time around the world. But the idea of using a brush to clean the teeth, it doesn't appear to become common in Europe until the 18th century. So we go right past Shakespeare. It seems unlikely that Shakespeare would have had one for that reason. In fact, we don't actually get the word toothbrush as a compound in the English language until later on in the 17th century. And that's not to say that Shakespeare didn't care about keeping his teeth clean at all. There's lots of references in Shakespeare to toothlessness and black teeth and rotten teeth, and breath as well. He's very concerned about the sweetness of people's breath. So there was lots of other different techniques for keeping the teeth clean in the 16th century, such as toothpicks and toothcloths. And this is where somebody would rub their teeth with an abrasive material to remove any sort of build-up of dirt on their teeth. And there was definitely a market for this around Shakespeare's time. It's difficult to say whether Shakespeare himself was keen on keeping his teeth clean. We don't, obviously have that sort of record. But like I say, he makes a lot of references to it, to toothache, toothlessness. So we can assume he had some degree of the awareness of oral hygiene, even without an understanding of bacteria and tooth decay that we have now. So when you look at medical or anatomical texts from this time period, information about keeping your teeth clean tends to be filed under the section which deals with evil smells or soreness. So it seems like there was an understanding of the need for preventative oral care.
Well, you're mentioning like teeth claws that they're rubbing at their teeth with. Was there any kind of toothpaste? Would they have put anything on the cloth to rub in their teeth?
Yeah, quite often, yeah. It wasn't known as toothpaste. Toothpaste as a term came much later. But I've mentioned rubbing the teeth with the toothcloth, like you say. So this is described in lots of medical manuals at the time, and it's often called a dentifrice, which looks to me like a precursor for toothpaste. So dentifrice is identified in the Oxford English Dictionary as a powder or preparation for cleaning the teeth. The earliest known instance of dentifrice is 1542. It's worth noting that references to dentifrices tend to be limited to non-fiction texts, such as medical or beauty manuals. So the extent to which this made it into general culture is difficult to say for certain. However, these dentifrices are made of such abrasive materials, like it's quite frightening to think of putting them anywhere near your teeth. They were made of things like ground coral, crab shells are in one recipe, like made into a powder. So that suggests to me that these powders might have been quite damaging to the teeth quite often. So maybe that explains for why perhaps they went in and out of fashion. There's lots of recipes for the whitening of the teeth, suggesting this was a beauty ideal back then as well. But toothpaste itself and toothpaste as a term doesn't come until much later in the early 19th century.
Well, what about flossing their teeth? You mentioned that there were toothpicks. Were people flossing in between their teeth with anything?
Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you? You would think that would be the natural kind of next step, but toothpicking is very common, like I say. So in early modern literature, we get a lot of toothpicks, but flossing seems to have been really quite surprisingly late. It's certainly in the UK, at least as far as we can tell from what's in print. So there's archaeological evidence of toothpicking, which goes way back to ancient civilizations. They found Neanderthal remains with grooves in their teeth, suggesting toothpicking is an ancient art form. We've got that nailed. We're happy with that. But as far as flossing goes, as far as I can tell from my research, it was first publicly recommended by a dentist in New Orleans, by a dentist called Levi Spear Palmley in 1819, who recommended running a waxen thread through the gaps in between the teeth. Now, 1819, that's 200 years ago, just over 200 years ago. And I find that quite remarkable that there's no record of anything resembling flossing until that recently. I think especially when you think about the fact that, it's quite well documented that monkeys floss, there's especially, Japanese macaques are teaching their infants to floss their teeth. And yet it takes us a long time to catch on. I presume they're copying us, but it takes us a long time to catch on to that. And why that is a bit of a mystery to me. And I wonder whether it's to do with maybe not being able to find suitable material. Maybe people had the idea for flossing, but the materials that they used were just too abrasive. And so it never quite made it into print as like a recommendation. Also, they kind of had a good solution for having, if there was debris between their teeth, they had a solution for it. They had toothpicks. So if they were able to remove tooth decay, which was often known as scurf, they called it scurf on the teeth. If they had a solution for removing that plaque, it's almost like, well, why do we need anything else? Because they don't know necessarily about bacteria and how that can build up without us knowing about it. And so, they wouldn't necessarily know there was a buildup of bacteria between the teeth until there's a real problem and they'd need the teeth removing. So there's arguably maybe not an obvious need for floss, especially with the toothpick solution. So this is something I would say flossing is perhaps something that's come with greater knowledge of bacteria infection and gum health.
Well, you've mentioned the tooth picking was common, but I wonder if there was variance among the materials that were used for toothpicks. I know the clown in A Winter's Tale is saying that he's able to distinguish a nobleman from a lowly peasant based on how they pick their teeth. And I think this is really a surprising reference for us in as a modern consumer of this play. Why in the 16th century was it possible to make this distinction based on how someone picked their teeth?
So when it comes to toothpicks, what they were made of, I get the impression that the kind of maybe unfortunate answer is whatever you had to hand that was pointy at the end and would fit between your teeth. You know, there's accounts from this period. There's been toothpicks fashioned from things like feathers and quills, from wood, from plants with robust stalks. Bonus points if it's something aromatic, such as chervil, that works really nicely as a toothpick. Perhaps some of the more, because of course the other thing you get in this time period is ornamental toothpicks and people wearing them around the neck to show that they are somebody of refinement, and this sort of idea that, I'm somebody who looks after my teeth and I have this very ornamental toothpick made of perhaps precious metals such as gold or silver, or made of bone, and that sort of expensive material. You see a bit of that around the 17th century. Some examples where they've got, which sounds like it's asking for trouble to me, it's got a toothpick on one end and what's called an ear scoop on the other. So you'd obviously have to be very careful about getting the right one in the right place. And so they become like a real kind of, they're a functional thing, but they're also to some extent a fashionable thing. But then it gets more complicated because, human nature being what it is, I don't know whether this is maybe particularly true of British culture, where something becomes fashion, mockery soon follows. And what we start to see in the late 16th, early 17th century conduct manuals, such as the very popular, widely distributed Il Galateo, or a treatise of manners or behaviours published in mid 16th century Verona. And that was translated and published in English in 1576. We see warnings against using toothpicks in public and brandishing at a dinner table. There's a quote from that text that says, "Likewise, you must not rub your teeth with your napkin, and much less with your fingers, for these be tricks for a sloven. Neither must you openly rinse your mouth with the wine and then spit it forth. Neither is it gentlemanlike to carry a stick in your mouth from the table when you rise, like the bird that builds her nest, or put it in your ear, for that is a barber's trick. And to wear a toothpick about your neck of all fashions, that is the worst." And I think the idea of using a toothpick ostentatiously has reached British humour certainly by the time we've got The Winter's Tale. And it seems to me that Shakespeare uses that reference really to make the audience laugh. So we know Shakespeare's clowns are often insightful and wise, but The Winter's Tale clown is gullible and easily manipulated. And knowing this, it's hardly surprising then in this scene that he's taken in by Autolycus' appearance as a nobleman. And in seeing evidence of his nobleness, the clown notes that this is clearly a great man. He looks like he's dressed up to the nines. He's clearly a great man, I'll warrant. I'll know by the picking on his teeth. So the fact that he's picking his teeth tells me that he's nobility. And the audience knows at that moment this is an outmoded way of indicating nobility, and that the clown has been easily tricked. And Autolycus knows that, he's used that consciously as a trick because he knows that the clown will fall for it, and he's sort of got him where he wants him. The toothpick is also an outmoded fashion. We see this again in All's Well That Ends Well in the opening scene when Parolles tries to convince Helen that her virginity is worthless. And he argues with her. He says, "Virginity, like an old courtier, wears her cap out of fashion, richly suited, but unsuitable, just like the brooch and the toothpick, which wear not now." So there seems to be a cultural understanding there that Shakespeare plays on about toothpicks, what they represent when people flaunt them. And so it's clear that we also have to bear in mind, obviously, getting back to the materials, where toothpicks were visible, there will have been some sort of hierarchy in the materials that we use, because obviously only the very wealthy would be able to afford those ornamental picks made of gold or silver or bone. But I'm not quite sure that it carries that kind of universal symbolism of wealth or refinement by the time we get to Shakespeare's day. I think it becomes kind of the butt of the joke.
You've referenced that they cared a lot about the fragrance of their breath, and that bad breath was something to be defended against or even prevented with things like chervil or the other kind of stick you mentioned, the chewing stick that was made out of something that would give fragrance to the breath. And I wonder if there was any kind of liquid substance like a mouthwash that was used for rinsing out the mouth and preventing bad breath. Are there records of anything like this from Shakespeare's lifetime?
Yeah, so there's quite a few recipes and recommendations for different mouthwashes. Mouthwash as a term doesn't appear in the English language till the early 19th century, which is interesting because it is a long-lived concept. It's something that I think people were doing to wash the mouth and the teeth with various different concoctions. I think that's existed for an awfully long time. But I think bad breath in itself is very complex in this time period because it wasn't always necessarily attributed to decaying teeth, but was, and I suppose this is maybe true again today to some extent, but it would often be seen as indicative of a very much more serious health problem than just a dental problem, such as ulcerated lungs or problems with the stomach. And at this point, I think it's important to recognise that in the 16th century and early 17th century, there was still a strong belief in the health of the body being governed by the humoral system. For those not familiar with this, it was suggested that there was 4 key bodily fluids which determined not only a person's health, but also their temperament. And these were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And saliva would be considered as phlegmatic because it's both cold and wet. And the reason I'm giving you that detail is because it complicates the idea of having bad breath and the purpose of mouthwashes. So we were using them to clean the teeth and to wash the mouth to get rid of bad smells. But also we see accounts like there's one in Thomas Collins' text, Choice and Rare Experiments in Physical Surgery, published just a bit later than Shakespeare's lifetime in 1658. And he recommends using mouthwashes to purge the humours from the gums which descend out of the head. And this isn't uncommon in medical texts in this era. And it adds just a really serious dimension, I think, to the presence of bad breath. It's not just about oral health. It's about your kind of general health as well. And so it makes finding a cure, such as a mouthwash, quite urgent. And also, we have to be careful with mouthwashes as well, because it might upset that balance. So recipes for mouthwashes, you see a lot of them, like they are very kind of widely recommended. They're often based on things like rose water, which is claimed to whiten the teeth and keep the breath sweet, or you think are often quite readily available. So rinsing the mouth with white wine or vinegar. And I think the idea of them being acidic to make them good at cleaning, I think they're often chosen for those kind of properties as well, and also for whitening the teeth. But obviously, if you're choosing to rinse your mouth in something acidic, you're quite often causing some kind of damage there as well, potentially long term. So I would say, in conclusion, that people were using mouthwashes in this period, but it wasn't necessarily just about bad breath. It was kind of, it had a broader implication to their health as well.
If they weren't calling it mouthwash, but they were writing these recipes that told you what to use, what were they calling it? What do we look for if we're looking through these medical manuals for an example?
Yeah, they will call it very similar things. We just don't get that compound. So they'll call it, a wash for the mouth, or a rinse. They call it a rinse quite often, or a mouth rinse. It sort of uses very adjacent terms. We just don't get that compound mouthwash. And so I suppose it's more marketable, isn't it, as a term?
Welcome to the advertising age, brings us words like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, did people ever hire someone for the purpose of having their teeth cleaned professionally? And if so, who was the person that would perform this kind of cleaning?
I would say the closest thing you could hope for in terms of a professional clean might be to consult somebody like a barber surgeon who if tooth drawing and tooth cleaning would be maybe part of their repertoire. There would be some who might consider it beneath them, but it certainly appears as part of their repertoire in some texts. There are also accounts of mountebanks offering tooth cleaning services, such as with having various instruments and concoctions. And the mountebank is like a kind of rogue tradesperson who would move around following where the business was and making money from offering a range of services, one of which was tooth cleaning. And in his book, there's a really interesting book, The Long Climb, from barber surgeons to doctors of dental surgery. This came out after I'd completed my doctorate. It would have been very useful. And it's written by Phileas Roy Garrant. And he suggests that these mountebanks were actually responsible for instilling a lot of fear in people about dentistry and having things done to the mouths, because they'd often leave people in a worse state than when they found them, with their kind of quackery, their sort of ad hoc solutions for things. There was quite a lot of anxiety about things like toothache and bad breath being caused by something, I'm not sure if you've come across this before, but tooth worms, which was literally tiny worms living under the teeth. And that was why the teeth would become loose, because they're Yeah, it's gross.
Horrible.
Yeah, it's really gross. But just when you thought it couldn't get any worse. So there's accounts of mountebanks, because their main thing is about making money and putting on a show to attract people to, sell their treatment. So what they would do is prepare a mouthwash with some kind of sediment in the bottom, so that when the patient spat the mouthwash into the bowl, the mountebank could point out, look, there's the evacuated tooth worms. They were in your head and now they're in this bowl. So, you're cured, you're welcome, and take payment. So they would put on quite a show. And there's also accounts in that same book of them. Garrett points out that they would carry lots of tools, because it would make it look like only they could do the tooth cleaning, because they were the ones who had all these array of tools, So yeah, good businessmen, but perhaps not the best medical practitioners. There's a really significant text in the history of dentistry, which comes in 1686, so a bit later than Shakespeare's time. It's called The Operator for the Teeth, and it's by Charles Allen. So we're still in the early modern period. He recommends in the opening of that text, if you are going to have your teeth cleaned by somebody else, please choose somebody who is skilled in tooth cleaning, lest they make the problem worse than it is already by, and this is a quote, breaking the film that unites the gums to the teeth, or by taking away the gloss of the teeth. So we're starting to get an awareness of, potential damage to teeth through abrasive cleaning practices. And though this text does come later in the 17th century, it underlines those existing anxieties about losing tooth enamel or damaging gums through abrasive or overly aggressive cleaning techniques. And the fact that he had to include that guidance in 1686 suggests that it was, people were doing this. It was fairly common practice to pay somebody to give your teeth a good clean. But I'm guessing, if you did pay somebody, I'm guessing the results would be fairly variable and potentially quite damaging.
I was worried enough about my teeth falling out, and I was horrified enough about Shakespeare's lifetime by the idea of rotten teeth, the whole concept of there being worms in the mouth. Oh, I didn't even want to think that could be real. And this fear of dentistry from the mountebanks, I think that reputation lasted way longer than they would have predicted.
Yeah.
Coriolanus gives an admonishment that people should wash their face and keep their teeth clean. Was there a cultural stigma around ignoring your oral hygiene? And if so, what was considered the standard basics? If you were a good person who took care of themselves the way society said that you should, what would that include?
This was a big question in my thesis. It was one I've spent a lot of time trying to kind of get to the bottom of. And I would say from my research that I don't think I can sit here and confidently say there was a stigma about having a dental hygiene routine as such. There's certainly copious evidence that the beauty ideal of having a full set of straight white teeth existed, even in an age where this seems like that would be a difficult thing to achieve. Further, there's lots of evidence of stigma surrounding rotten teeth and tooth loss, though it's worth noting that this is frequently associated with aging rather than a poor dental hygiene routine. It's often, something that we connect with getting older. This suggests that having profound tooth loss at a young age was not necessarily the norm. So it's worth remembering, but also in that, I suppose it's worth remembering that the early modern diet was very different to ours. So sugar was less readily available to those who weren't rich. So tooth decay was arguably less likely than those living in, say, the Victorian age when diets start to become a lot richer. It's impossible to say with confidence what was considered like an accepted basic regimen for tooth cleaning, because we just don't have that evidence available, as the guidance for these practices gives you kind of the recipe for what you should use, but doesn't necessarily say how often you should do it. Quite often the guidance is just after a meal or after a big meal, or, it's very sort of vague on that score. And part of the motivation behind my thesis wasn't necessarily to contest the idea. I think there's like a generally held idea that people in the early modern period didn't care about the teeth. They didn't bother with that sort of thing. And it wasn't necessarily to completely contest that and throw that idea out, but it was more to explore that question of whether culturally it was broadly expected that people had bad teeth and tooth loss, whether that was just the norm. And I don't believe that it was. I think most people managed to keep their teeth. And I do believe that's supported by archaeological evidence of the time as well. So the medical literature at the time offered plenty of ideas for caring for your own teeth. And whilst those medical texts wouldn't necessarily be accessible to the general public, it suggests that there was a demand for that sort of guidance. And aside from the stigma of perhaps having poor dental health, the options for what to do with teeth that had been neglected were so limited, and in many cases quite scary, as we've touched on. It seems as though that would be your main motivator for at least keeping your teeth or your mouth as clean as you could. I'd also like to touch on here that it seemed to me, when looking at literature of this time period, that rotten teeth were particularly problematic to a woman. So it seems to me that there seems to be a connection forged between having rotten teeth and having rotten morals. And if you'd like to see an example of this, there's probably no clearer example of this than Robert Herrick's poetry collection, which is called Hesperides, or the works both humane and divine, of Robert Herrick from 1648. And if you take a look at that, you'll see. I'm not going to go into detail, but you'll see what I mean. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But so I think the stigma comes from not necessarily having a poor oral hygiene routine, but from having teeth that look bad. So it's more about the outcome of that. I don't think there was necessarily people were expecting people to have a certain practice that they did every day necessarily, if that makes sense.
When someone did ignore their oral hygiene or perhaps lost all of their teeth, were there options for things like dentures?
There were options, but not necessarily ones that you'd want, I suppose. So we didn't have porcelain false teeth until the late 18th century. So realistically, before this time, you're looking at false teeth that are made of ivory or even existing teeth from other humans or from animals. The mountebanks that I mentioned earlier would offer solutions for missing teeth. This was something that you start to see in advertisements a bit later than Shakespeare's time, but sort of later in the 17th century, such as a white poultice, like a sort of putty that could be shaped and pushed into a gap between the other teeth. Other solutions included stuffing things like a small amount of balled up cloth in to plug the gap. So we're just literally looking at appearance. It would have no sort of functionality in terms of being able to eat with them in. There are some accounts of using existing teeth from animals, as I mentioned, and other humans, and trying to fix these together using wire and trying to affix that in the mouth. But successful accounts of this are very limited. I would say, you really don't see many of them at all. Indeed, evidence of this practice broadly seems to suggest that the solution offered was actually worse than just living with missing teeth. It would cause more problems than it would fix. The poetry collection that I mentioned earlier, the Robert Herrick one, does have one of these rare references to a character that has a kind of fashioned denture, and it's like a short collection of poems, and this was like a gift to me when I was doing my thesis, but all of the poems in this collection, all of the characters have some sort of dental issue. There's something going on with their teeth. And he says that this character called Glasgow has 6 teeth, twice 2 of which are fashioned from some sort of handle, which is made of mutton bone. And it goes on to state that these teeth are not for use, but merely for the sight. The butt of that joke basically is this is a very vain character. He wears this sort of this sort of denture that he's got in, but it's about vanity. It's not about him regaining the function of those teeth. So the collection, they've all got something, but the teeth, the dental problems are used to cast judgments on kind of things as a society that are strange. And obviously there has to be an understanding about dentures and the problems they would cause for that kind of joke to work, because the poetry has to lead on existing cultural ideas for the audience to be able to follow the logic of it. So the vanity of Glasgow relies on the audience knowing that the denture he wears is functionally useless, but he wears it to improve his appearance and appear more youthful. And there were options as far as artificial teeth go, but not much evidence of their successful use or that they would reliably solve the problem of missing teeth in a safe or hygienic way.
In addition to the barber surgeon and the mountebank, was there such a thing as an early modern dentist? And were they the ones that you would go to for these kinds of services?
In short, the dentists don't exist yet in this time period. So we've got the expertise of the barber surgeons was formally recognised in 1540 when the Fellowship of Surgeons were merged with the Company of Barbers to form the Company of Barbers and Surgeons. And the idea of this was to create a clear distinction between those two professions, so they could map who was doing what basically. And the only activity both groups were allowed to do, both the barbers and the surgeons, was pulling of teeth. Both those groups had their own specialisms, but both kept their hand in as far as dentistry was concerned, which suggests to me that dentistry at this point is not necessarily seen as a specialist trade. It's something that different people can do. And the book I mentioned earlier, The Long Climb, also points out that even the royal household didn't have an appointed dental surgeon until the 17th century, which I think is where that role starts to become more clearly defined. And it's worth maybe noting at this point that France were very progressive in terms of shaping the dental profession, not least thanks to Pierre Fauchard, who is often lauded as the father of modern dentistry. His lifetime sits at the tail end of the modern period. So what options would somebody have in Shakespeare's time? Well, I've yet to find any evidence that someone in this period would visit someone to kind of preemptively have their teeth checked in the way that we would now. So that didn't exist yet. So it's safe to assume that people would generally only seek out somebody who knew about teeth or apparently knew about teeth if they were having some sort of issue, like their teeth needed a good clean, or if there was some kind of problem such as toothache or bad breath. And so your main options for treatment of this type rather than a dentist would be the barber surgeon, if you could find one willing, a mountebank, as mentioned before, or the tooth drawer, which strikes terror into people's hearts, I think, as the tooth drawer as a figure in literature is quite a kind of, they hold them in contempt. The tooth drawer is seen as a really kind of sinister figure, but the tooth drawer as a distinct profession dates back to at least the 14th century. And looking at references to tooth drawers in early modern literature, you soon see, they were held in contempt much the same way the mountebanks were in terms of their social status. But, they could get teeth out. There were people who knew how to get teeth out, so they were needed. And I think that's why the profession goes on, it persists. While dentists didn't exist, there were people being paid to do some of the jobs that a dentist would do. And some of the people making money through tooth drawing and cleaning might turn their hand to providing, maybe some kind of denture device if they've got the materials available. But this was kind of more likely out of an entrepreneurial, it's entrepreneurship and wanting to make money rather than a professional obligation to care for someone's oral health, which obviously is what we'd expect from the dental profession today.
Well, what about things like oral surgery or like a cleft lip or a cleft palate? Whenever someone had an issue of bone in their mouth, would the barber surgeon or someone have been available to deal with this? Maybe a physician?
In this period, there was certainly a great fear, I think, of operating in the mouth, because obviously when you operate in the mouth, the first thing that happens is lots of blood appears, and it's difficult to know how to stem that, especially when it's it's in the location that it is, and people need to be able to breathe, and so things like certainly the congenital cleft palate wasn't operated on until later in the 17th century. And we've got the guy I mentioned before, Pierre Fauchard, to thank for that. He developed cleft palate surgery. Cleft lips, I think, quite often may have been left as they were, but they were sometimes operated on. I know there's accounts of cleft lip surgery that go back to Paré. So we're going like way back, way before Shakespeare's time. Interestingly, with the cleft lip in particular, because this goes into, and we're kind of veering away from dentistry to some degree here, but I don't know if you're familiar with the maternal imagination and the implications of that. Yeah,
we've covered that on our show. Where we really talked about that. Yeah, it's
really fascinating. So the term that you see used in Shakespeare's time for the cleft lip is the hare lip, which you still hear used today, actually quite frequently, but it is, Oxford English Dictionary rightly has it down as offensive, because nobody likes to be compared to a hare. The origins of that term is that maternal imagination belief that when a pregnant woman was startled by a hare, or she ate the meat of a hare while she was pregnant, that she would then produce a baby that has that appearance.
Oh, you're talking about a hare like a rabbit.
Like a rabbit, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and it's because they thought they would be scared by them while she was pregnant, then the baby would be born with this.
Yeah, it would have the mark of the hare, which is the split top lip. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think sometimes often when the term hare lip is used today, people assume that it's hair as in hair on your head. And it's because people tend to have quite a fine scar. So they assume that, it's called hare lip because they've got that fine scar that's like as fine as a hair. But it isn't. It's to do with rabbits. It's to do with hares, the animals. This term persists. Unfortunately, we're working hard to kind of get rid of it, but it does still persist. You see it in contemporary literature. You see it used. I've even seen it used in medical practice, more recently. But yeah, so this term has that origination of the pregnant woman being startled by the hare, eating the meat of hare, produces baby with the hare, and Shakespeare makes use of this. So Harelip appears twice in Shakespeare's plays. It appears in King Lear, when Edgar does that famous speech about "this is the foul fiend, flippity gibbet." He begins at curfew and walks till the first cock. He gives the web and the pin, squints the eye, and makes the harelip. So it's that idea of him being mischievous and putting things just a bit wrong. He's sort of going around and changing things so that making things go wrong, basically, and sort of blights the baby with the harelip. And it also appears in Midsummer Night's Dream, where it talks about Oberon, just a speech about now until the break of day, that speech. And he talks about the blots of nature's hand. And he says, "And the blots of nature's hand shall not in their issue stand, never mole, harelip, nor scar, nor mark prodigious, such are despised in nativity." So again, he's using it as like a symbol of things that can go wrong, basically. And I think unfortunately in this time period, if you were born, because cleft lips and palates can happen independently of each other. So I had both, but some people have one or the other. And in this time period, if you were born with a cleft lip, I think you had quite a good chance of survival. But if you were born with a cleft palate, unfortunately, there just wasn't much they could do for you. There is talk in some texts of things called obturators, which can be fitted into the palate, but it comes later. That's not really a thing in this time period. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of babies born with that wouldn't have survived. But this is where it was the cleft lip and palate is where I started. So my undergraduate dissertation was on cleft lip and palate in 20th century literature. So we look at things like Thomas Harris and, contemporary literature. And then I started to realise that there was much more to it. And then that led me to discovery of the history of the harelip term. And, the rest is history. That was where it took me.
As it is. So perfect for our conversation today. I know we would love to learn more about this topic. What are some of your favorite books or resources that we should start with if we want to dive into this history a little further?
Okay, look, what I'm going to do, I'm going to recommend a couple of books that were really useful to me during my thesis. And there's one that I've already mentioned that came out after my thesis, which I think people will find really interesting too. So the first one that I recommend is one called White as Whalebone, Dental Services in Early Modern England by A.S. Hargreaves. And this is basically what it says on the tin. It's all about dental services in early modern England, and it's a really useful resource on that. It's widely available secondhand. I found a secondhand copy of that one. There's also, if you're interested in dentistry in particular, the broader history of it, there's Dentistry, an illustrated history by Malvin E. Ring. He is from the dental profession. He's somebody who took an interest in the kind of history side of dentistry. And a kind of broader one, that's if you're interested in the history of body and history of medicine, is Blood and Guts by Roy Porter. So it's Blood and Guts, a short history of medicine by Roy Porter. And that's just kind of, it's not a very long book, but if you are somebody who's interested in just, learning more about the history of the body and the way that the body was understood from somebody who's a very engaging writer, Blood and Guts by Roy Porter would be my third recommendation. The one that came out after my doctorate was done came out in 2013, and that was written by Phileas Roy Garrant, and that's called The Long Climb from Barber Surgeons to Doctors of Dental Surgery, and that is kind of an updated version of White as Whalebone, and it sort of tracks the development of the dental profession, and it's a really interesting read as well.
Thank you so much for these recommendations. This is an excellent place to begin if you'd like to dive into the history of oral hygiene and dental care for Shakespeare's lifetime. And we will place links to Laura's thesis along with links to these books in the show notes for today's episode, so you can read her work as well. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find that. Laura, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Do you know, this was the question I found hardest to answer of all the questions. And I don't know if this is maybe cheating, because what I would like to do is, when I was a first year at university as an undergraduate, we did a poetry module that blew my mind. It was brilliant. And it really opened my eyes to how clever poetry was. It really developed my interest in Shakespeare and the way he wrote as well. On this module, one of our key texts was the Norton Anthology of Poetry. So this contains poems from across the world, dating from the medieval period to today. And now my copy of it is a bit wrecked. It's battered, not just from reading it, but I kind of dropped it in puddles on the way to lectures and used it to prop open doors and things. It's a really big book. But yeah, so I'd probably invest in a new copy of the latest edition, and I'd take that with me, please. And I think that would get me through most days.
That sounds like an excellent selection for sure. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
As I mentioned, I graduated with my doctorate in 2013, and I knew at that point that what I wanted to do was go and teach English at secondary school level, so age 11 to 18 years. So that was what I did for a number of years. And since then, I've moved into teaching in university. So my interest, as you know, very different to what I was doing before. I'm really interested in higher education and pedagogy and that kind of thing. However, in the background, I'm still, I wrote a blog post not long ago for the Cleft Lip and Palate Association in the UK about the cultural history of cleft lip and palate, which did form part of my thesis. And it's a condition that I myself was born with. So I'm still very interested in that research. I'd do that for fun. You know what I mean? That's kind of what kind of stuck with me from my earlier research. So I would say in terms of my research interest that's connected with the doctorate and the things we've been talking about today, I'd still be very interested in talking to people about the social history of that condition and facial difference as well. I think as an area of interest as well is something that still very much lights my fire.
Well, I will definitely look forward to hearing what you get up to in the future as far as your future research and your work that you're doing. It's certainly been wonderful to talk with you today, and I appreciate you being here to share with us the history of oral hygiene and dental care for Shakespeare's lifetime.
Thank you very much, Cassidy. Thanks for having me on.
The list of resources and recommendations we've been talking about today, along with more information on our guest and how you can follow their work, is available in the show notes for today's episode. You can find all of these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 334. If you'd like more in-depth visual history related to our show today, including archival images, links to some of these primary documents, and the case studies that we talked about of people with real oral health issues or the recipes for mouthwash and tooth scrubbing, if you would like to really dive into that nitty-gritty part of this history, then check out the detailed show notes. These are available for patrons of our show, and they're right there on the regular show notes page. You can click the button that says Become a Patron to either join us as a patron right now, or you can log in if you're already a supporter of our show using your Patreon credentials. And either way, all of these detailed content will expand right there on the show notes page. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 334. That's CassidyCash.com/EP334. Each week, That's Shakespeare Life is completely free to listen, and that is made possible by our patrons. Patrons are the lifeblood of our show here at That's Shakespeare Life, and to say thank you for being the power behind our show, patrons get access to a library of bonus content, including detailed show notes on all of our episodes, along with video streaming library content like documentaries, animated plays, virtual tours, and so much more. Each week, patrons drive the work we do here with an insider's look to the making of our show, including sneak peeks at upcoming guests and the chance to submit your questions to be asked during an interview. If you love learning history here with us each week and you'd like to support our work, please consider becoming a patron today. Learn more and sign up right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.